In this lesson, we're going to take a look at rigging quadrupeds. Now, the good news is, after learning everything you've learned about rigging humanoid characters in this course, you really basically have everything you need to rig a quadruped. In the simplest sense, a quadruped is really just a biped on all fours. And once you understand some of the basics of comparative anatomy, it should be pretty easy to figure out how to rig up a quadruped using what you've learned about rigging bipeds. Our handy cheat sheet PDF for this lesson has a nice little chart dealing with comparative anatomy, and we're going to talk about it here too. In fact, even the way Duick-Basel names the structures for quadrupeds by having the names be very similar to the names used for bipedal characters helps you see how that comparative anatomy works pretty easily. And we've named the artwork layers for these characters in a similar way. Now we're going to start with this kind of skeletal cat here to help kind of see how the structure goes together. And then we'll take a look at how this all applies to a more traditional character with flesh and fur and whatnot. So let's start by reviewing the artwork and some of the structural elements we already have in place here in Skelecat Rig 1. So let's start by soloing just the back leg pieces here, the left back leg pieces color-coded red here. Let's just solo those 4 layers. And let's kind of look at these one at a time. There's a misconception about quadrupeds and other animals that their knees bend backwards, which is people referring to this type of shape here. But it's not that the animal's knees bend backwards. It's that this isn't a knee. This is actually the heel. The knee is up here pointing the same direction that a human knee points. So note here we have the thigh piece here attaching to the pelvis, of course, but it sits very high on the body on most quadrupeds. Then we have the calf connecting to that at the knee, of course. And then the foot attaches at the heel to that calf, but again, it's not flat on the ground, it's up in the air. And the weight of the character is supported on the ball of the foot or the toes. Now, in the Duick structure terminology, the term claws is used. So we're going to use that term too. But you can think about the claws as the toes or the fingers in the case of the arms. So the weight of the character is on those toes or claws. And then that, of course, attaches to the foot with the heel up in the air, then the calf, then the thigh. And we get this kind of Z shape. So in terms of creating a structure for the leg, we're going to have the same pieces, thigh, calf, foot, and toes, or in this case, claws. They're just arranged slightly differently. So let's go ahead and create the structure for this leg here. So let's go into the Create Structures tab, and we're going to go down to the leg options. Now right now we have the plantigrade, humans and primates, bears, rabbits, which is structured in this way. But in this case, we're dealing with a cat, so we want the digitigrade, which is dogs, cats, dinosaurs, birds, and so on. So let's go ahead and click that, and you can see the structures are the same. The only name that's changed is claws, but the arrangement has changed, again with that heel up in the air. So let's go ahead and create that structure, and we're going to grab those structure elements, move them down. Again, nothing new here. Note that one difference is we don't have that extra heel structure element for the heel and toe roll, because again, the weight of the character is on the claws or the toes. Now, just like we've done before, we simply need to align this to our artwork using our markers. I'm going to fast forward through this since we've done this so many times. Now we're going to wait to auto-rig this until we've got all of our structures in place, and we're going to auto-rig everything all at once. So let's leave that leg for now and move on to the arm. So let's again solo these arm pieces, these orange layers here. Now here is where we have one difference from the bipeds that we've been working with, in that we are now going to include a shoulder element. This element up here. In skeletal terms, this part of the skeleton would actually be called the scapula. Now, it's not necessary to include a scapula piece in your quadruped rig, but it does provide a nice level of realism to your rig. And if you can include it, it's a nice addition. But you can just go right from the arm down if you wish. So note we have a shoulder, an arm, a forearm, a hand piece, which is this little piece right down here, and then of course the front claws coming off of that. So we have a similar situation where the weight of the character in comparative anatomy terms is on the fingers, or you could say on the knuckles and the fingers. This joint here, where the hand meets the forearm, would of course be the wrist in terms of comparative anatomy, and the elbow is up here. This again gives that kind of idea of a backwards knee, but it's not a knee at all. It's an elbow, and it's just bending back as if you've got your arms to your side, and again you're walking on all fours. And you can turn yourself into a quadruped at any time by just getting down on all fours and balancing on your knuckles and fingers of your hand and your toes and the ball of your feet in the back. So let's again create a structure for this arm. So let's go into the arm options. And once again, we're going to want the digitigrade. And this time we're going to include a shoulder and the claws or the fingers. And again, you can think of the claws as the fingers in comparative anatomy. Let's go ahead and create that structure. Let's move these down and into place. And again, there's no difference here from a biped arm. The only thing we've done is add the claws or fingers and the shoulder or the scapula. So let's once again snap these into place. I'm going to fast forward through this once again. Now, if you're following along, note that the shoulder is actually called the shoulder neck marker because the pivot point of the shoulder in this design is shared with the neck. It's also shared with both shoulders, the right and the left. And then also note that the arm marker is also shared by both the right and the left arm pieces. Okay, now that we have our arm and leg structures, and of course the right side is already done, we've just done the left side here. Let's take a look at the body artwork and the spinal structure. So just like we've done for our bipedal characters, the body is a single piece from the pelvis all the way up through the neck where the head attaches. The head is a single pre-comped layer and contains the pieces of the eye, so we can rig pupil movement and eye blinks. But note that the ears, the right and left ears, which sit right on top of one another, are left as separate elements. They're not precomposed into the head, which is in most cases the best way to handle ears that you may want to rig for movement. We're going to look at ear rigging a little later on. Now, of course, this being a cat and many quadrupeds you're going to work with are going to have tails. So note that in this case, we have the original tail that was created by the designer. It's got a little lower opacity on it there, and it's included as an example of kind of the intention of the designer for that tail. But we really don't want to try to rig tails already curved. In most cases, that's not a good idea. One of the things about the puppet tool is that it's not particularly good at straightening things that are already bent. It's pretty good, decent at least, at bending things that are straight, but it's not very good at taking something that's already bent and straightening it. So in most cases, when you want to rig a tail, you want to have that tail recreated, or you want to recreate it yourself, straight. So here we have the same tail straightened. And this will allow us to rig it so that it can bend. And if you want to hang on to the designer's original bent tail as a reference, you can do that. Now in this case, we're going to do an auto-rigged spine. So note that the structure that we've created for the spine is the same default spine structure that we created for our bipeds that we auto-rig. So we have the hips, we have two spine elements, spine 1 and spine 2, a neck and a head, and of course, as usual, the little spine tip right at the tip there. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this is laid out. You'll notice that we're kind of, to a certain degree, ignoring the curvature of the artwork here. And if you recall what we talked about in the torso rigging lesson, that we have to be aware that when the Bezier IK is added, and in the case of an auto-rigged spine, it's going to be added between the neck and spine 1. That's going to straighten spine 1 and spine 2 if they are curved. You also remember that with an auto-rigged spine, you can't really reposition the spine without moving other elements in the torso. So the best thing to do is to keep spine 1 and spine 2 perfectly straight. Now again, in this case, it takes us kind of away from the actual layout of the artwork, but it's not very far off. And with an auto-rig spine, we're just going to get that single mid-range control that just kind of bends us in the middle here. So even though we're not being exactly true to the way this artwork is laid out, this is close enough that we will get a decent deformation for this torso. Now note that the neck and the head marker provided us snapping points for the neck and the head structures. Spine 1 and spine 2 were just placed on the artwork in a logical way. And the hip structure was placed in between the two thigh structures. Now we just created one of the thigh structures here. So when I actually placed this hip structure, I simply used the hip markers and just placed the hips right in between those. The spine tip, of course, doesn't require any precise placement. I just placed it there at the nose of the character. Now note that we also have ear structures in place here. They're sitting right on top of one another because the ears are sitting right on top of one another. And we did have a marker guide shared for both ears to snap those structures too. And again, we're going to look at ear rigging later. In this case, we've just got the ear structures parented to the head structure, sort of as you'd expect, and then the ear artwork parented to those ear structures. No real big surprises there. We're going to do the simplest possible ear rigging with the Skelecat character, and then we're going to look at a couple of more complicated ways of rigging ears later on. Now that we've got both of our thigh structures available as guides for our puppet pins, we can go ahead and place our puppet pins on our body. So let's turn on the visibility of our two thigh structures. And because the right thigh is hidden here by the body, we'll just temporarily turn the opacity of the body down. And let's go ahead and place our puppet pins on our body layer. Now I'm going to fast forward through this because there's absolutely nothing different about this from the way we placed our puppet pins for our auto-rigged torsos with the bipeds. 2 on the hips, 1 for each spine, neck, and the head. In this case, there's no shoulder pins necessary because, of course, our shoulders are now part of our arm rig. And there's no part of the torso artwork on a side view quadruped generally that needs deforming. In some rare cases, perhaps with a 3/4 or front view quadruped, you may have some shoulder pieces jutting out from the artwork that may require pins for deformation. But it's honestly going to be pretty rare. Even if you don't include the shoulder structure or a separate piece of shoulder artwork for the quadruped's arm rigs, even in those cases, you're rarely going to need any pins for the shoulders on the torso. So let's add our pins, run our bone script, and parent our bones in. I'm going to fast forward again because there's nothing different than what we've done before here. Same exact procedure that we've used with the bipeds. Okay, now that we've got our pins in place, our bones created, and our bones parented to our structure, we're almost ready to auto-rig this whole character. But we need to include the tail. So the first thing we need to do is create a structure for the tail. Let's turn off our example tail here and just solo just the tail artwork. And let's solo the tail marker guide here as well. Let's go to our Create Structures tab and look at the tail options. Now, the options for the tail is simply a choice of how many layers you want for the tail. The default is 3 layers. But if you're going to be doing a Bezier IK rig for a tail, which we're going to do first here, and then we're going to look at what I think is really a better way to rig tails a little later on. But an even number is a good option for a Bezier IK rig tail because it means you'll have a bend point right in the middle where the mid controller is. Now, the other important thing about tail segments is that if you're using a puppet tool, it's not necessary to have lots and lots of tail segments unless your tail is very, very long, because then you're going to have a lot of puppet pins, and in many cases, too many puppet pins can actually make the deformation of curves a little less attractive, and it's often a little better to go with fewer pins rather than more pins. Of course, it depends a little bit on the artwork, but that's often the case, that fewer pins is going to give you a cleaner deformation than lots and lots of pins. So it's not necessary to have lots and lots of tail segments, which would then equal lots and lots of puppet pins. A few tail segments with a few pins will create fairly nice soft curves in most cases. Now, if your tail is actually jointed, if it's actually made up of separate jointed pieces, then I actually recommend doing lots of segments of the tail and lots of tail structure pieces, because the more separate pieces you have, the softer the curve is going to be on the tail. But overall, I recommend using the puppet tool for the tail. Just like with torsos, the puppet tool is in most cases going to give you the best, softest, most natural deformation. Now, if you're creating a 100% vector tail, you can either use something like rubber hose, which does a very good job of bending vector elements, or you can create a vector tail with several control points with Bezier handles, and then once again use Duick's bone script, which, as we've looked at, will actually create bones for control points and Beziers on vector layers. Then you can tie those bones to your structure layers, and you'll create very nice, clean vector curves on your tail. But with raster art, the puppet tool is the way to go. So let's change our tail segments to 4. Let's go ahead and create that tail structure. Now we want to align this tail to our artwork. And of course, we have our initial snapping point, which is our little guide there. Now we want to align the rest of the tail structures along the tail, and we want them to be equidistant. That's going to give us the nicest deformation along the tail. So I'll show you a nice little trick for getting your tail segments evenly distributed along the tail. So let's select tail structures 2 through the tail end here, and let's hit the P key to open their position values. And notice that the position values are already equidistant, and so with these all selected, we can just type in a value here. Let's try 300. Oops, that's a little too short. And notice that they're equally spaced. They're a little too short here. But let's try 310. Oh, that's pretty close. Let's maybe try 312. Let's creep that out just a little bit. There we go. So we've got the tail pieces now aligned along the tail, and they're equidistant from each other, which will give us a nice, smooth, clean curvature when we start animating the tail. So note that the tail doesn't sit perfectly straight out from its pivot point. It kind of sits a little lower, so these elements are a little high along the tail here, even though this is snapped where it should be. So let's just select tail 2 here, and let's just inch that down a little bit so the structures are centered vertically along the tail. Okay, that's looking really nice. We can go ahead and turn off that marker guide, and now that our structures are in place, we can go ahead and add puppet pins and bones to this tail. Again, I'm going to fast forward through this since there's nothing really new here. Now the base of the tail, the root of the tail structure, we'll want to parent that to the hips, fairly obviously. The hips, remember, essentially represent the pelvis, and of course the tail would be connected to the pelvis. So we now have all of our structures in place here, and we've even got our puppet tools set and our bones created, and we've parented our bones into our structure. We can actually go ahead and parent our left arm and leg artwork to our structures. We forgot to do that before, but we can do that quickly. All fairly obvious. Thigh to thigh, calf to calf, foot to foot, claws to claws, shoulder to shoulder, arm to arm, forearm to forearm, hand to hand, and again, claws to claws. And we can also go ahead and parent our thigh and shoulder structures into our larger structure. So our thigh structure, of course, we're going to parent to the hips, and our shoulder structure, and remember this is going to be an auto-rigged spine, so we want to parent that to the neck structure because we're going to have that neck and shoulder control with that auto-rigged spine. Remember, as I talked about in the earlier lessons, once you get a little more familiar with the rigging process, you can do things in a little bit of a different order. We were tending to rig structure elements first and then parent artwork or bones to the structure. But in many cases, you can parent artwork or bones to the structure before you do the actual rigging. And the other thing we looked at the end of the torso lesson was how you can auto-rig an entire figure with one click of the auto-rig button. And we can do the same thing here, and we can even include the tail. We're going to exclude the ears because I'm going to walk you through, as I said, a few different ways of rigging ears. And I prefer the manually rigged ears we're going to look at. But you could include the ears if you wanted to, and you'll get a very simple, in this case, one-layer IK control over the ears. And you're welcome to try that if you like. Again, we're going to look at a few different ear rigging options later on, just so you know some of the different options available. But in this case, we're going to auto rig everything except the ears. So let's start in our Create Structures tab, and let's use the Select Structures button to select all of the structures in this composition. And then let's just Control click and just deselect the ear structures. Everything else we can leave selected. And then we can just go to Links and Constraints and click Auto Rig. Let's rename, recolor, reposition, and organize the controllers a little bit to make our rig a little more user-friendly. Now I'm again going to fast forward through this because there's nothing here we haven't done before, and you're welcome to set up your controllers however you wish. Okay, now that we've got our icons placed a little better and color-coded, we just have to do a little bit of additional parenting here to finish things up. Now notice that I named the curve control for the tail mid, just like we named the curve control for the torso mid, and then that we just turned off the visibility and will shy away the root of the tail and the spine root. But the root of the tail needs to be parented into our system here. So we're going to parent the root of the tail also to the pelvis controller. Now, I also like to alter the parenting just a little bit as we did in the torso lesson where we looked at the auto-rigged spine. I like to have the head controller not just control the rotation of the head, but also control the position of the head. And the way the parenting is set up right now, the head controller controls the rotation of the head, but it does not control the position of the head. So we're just going to make a small change there. Again, we did this before. And we're going to parent the head structure directly to the head controller. So now when we grab the head controller, now we can also move the position of the head as well as the rotation of the head. Now the only other small change I like to make is with the tail and the tail mid control. The auto rig script parents these to the cog, which makes some sense, but I actually prefer them parented to the pelvis. So if we lift the pelvis up and down, the tail moves just with the pelvis. And remember that the pelvis is parented back to the cog, so it's still all going to move when the cog moves. But I think the tail should move independent when the pelvis moves. So we're going to grab the tail and the tail mid, and we're also going to parent those to the pelvis. Okay, once we've got all this parenting done, we want to zero out all of our controllers before we start messing around with them. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to select each one and zero it out. We'll fast forward through this. Let's also clean up a little bit. Let's select all of our structures and then hide them. And let's lock all those structures, lock all of our other layers here, and shy everything except our controllers. Whoops. And let's walk through the rig now and take a look at what we've got. Starting with the legs here, you can see when we pick up and move the leg, it really works exactly like a bipedal rig does. The only difference again is the heel is just up in the air. So it's as if the heel and toe roll is just sort of always got that heel jacked up in the air. Now we do have a set of foot roll controls. They're just a little bit different. So we have the tiptoe that allows us to go up on the very tip of the claws there. We have a claw control that allows us to bend those claws or toes. And then we have the foot roll, and that simply allows you to adjust the angle of that foot piece. So as you're posing the leg, this doesn't so much lift it up off the ground as it does just position the angle of that part of the foot. Now the arm now allows you to move the arm just like an arm would move, but notice that as we swing it back and forth, we get a little bit of movement in the shoulder as well. Now if you need additional movement from the shoulder, you also have a shoulder to rotation here that allows you to manually control the rotation of that shoulder. And you once again have a set of foot roll controls, and they work exactly the same way. We have a tiptoe, the claw rotation, and the foot roll, which now controls basically the hand bending at the wrist there. Now there's also a separate shoulder position control here that allows you to move the position of the shoulder if you need that. Doesn't really work that well with this particular design, but can come in handy in certain situations. Now I recommend, in terms of arranging our controllers here, putting the foot roll on top and the shoulder rotation and position under that in case you need those. You're not going to use those all the time, but you will occasionally use them. And this is a fully jointed rig here, so we also want to remember to turn off auto stretch. And let's do the same thing for the leg here. Let's turn off the auto stretch. And let's kind of set up these others the same way. They, of course, work exactly the same way. Oops, let's turn off that auto stretch. Put the foot roll on top, shoulder position, and shoulder rotation under that. Now our torso controls work the same way they did with the bipedal character, and we still have the situation where we just have the neck control rather than a chest control and a neck control. Now in this case, it's not quite as restrictive because we don't have shoulders that also rotate when we tilt the neck, but we do lose the kind of individual control over the chest. All we have is this mid control, which simply kind of curves the body overall. But it's a fairly decent level of control. Of course, we have the pelvis control, which allows us to move the position and the rotation of the pelvis. Oh, and of course, we can move the position of the neck too, to kind of position the front part of the character's body. But you can see it does kind of slightly odd things with the neck, which I again find a little bit difficult to work with. The cog, of course, controls the entire body altogether, just like we have seen before. So as usual, I prefer a manually rigged torso with a separate chest control, and we'll look at that in an upcoming rig. Now let's talk about the tail rig for a minute. When you auto-rig a tail, what you get is a Bezier IK rig for the tail. And the Bezier IK rig works okay for the tail, but I don't love it. And I actually prefer using a different rigging for the tail that we'll look at in a little bit. But let's take a look at this auto-rigged Bezier IK tail for just a minute and see what it can and what it can't do. So the way this is initially set up, you have a tail controller here that allows you to basically bend the tail up and down. And then we have a mid controller which allows you to bend the tail in the middle. Oops, and I'm going to turn off the guides here. We don't really need that guide there. But we do have this additional option here to show handles. I'm going to go ahead and click that on. And when you click that on, you get these two little buttons here. And what you can do with the buttons, if you double click on them, you're actually going to select the shape within the shape layer here. And if you click and drag on those, they'll actually allow you to create S-curves on the tail. Now this is cool, but you'll notice I have to go really, really far with these controllers to really get a decent S-curve on the tail. It also kind of stretches the tail out and changes the length of the tail. So it gives you some nice posing options. But for me, it's a little bit restrictive and it's a little bit clunky to work with. I think Bezier IK rigging has some great uses, but for me, the tail isn't really one of them. But this is what you will get if you auto-rig your tail. So let's jump over to Skelecat Rig 2, and let's take a look at what I think is a little better way to rig a tail. Now, if you like the idea of auto-rigging, and I don't blame you, you can still do all of your auto-rigging and just skip the tail. So what I would do in that case is select all structures, and then we're once again going to deselect the ear elements, but then let's also just deselect the tail elements. So we're just dealing with the spine and the arms and legs, and we can still auto-rig all of that. Now, in this case, I'm not going to take the time to rearrange and recolor all of these icons. We've been through that a bunch of times before. I'm just going to focus on the tail here. So let's just solo the tail. We can actually turn the bones off. We really don't need those. Let's just solo the tail and the tail structure elements here. And what we're going to do instead is create an FK overlap rig for this tail. And what's really cool about this is it'll give us individual control over each structure element in the tail, so we can do very specific manual posing, but it will give us automatic overlap and follow through, which is just so cool and a huge time saver and absolutely perfect for tails. And it's very, very easy to rig. All we have to do is just select our tail structure elements minus the end tail. So we're just going to select all of the tail elements except the end structure, and we just hit FK overlap. Now what we get is just this single controller here that we just need to parent to the hip controller or the pelvis controller. And again, I'm not going to take the time to rename all of these and all that stuff, but I'm just going to go ahead and parent that tail controller to the hips. So let's begin by just looking at the basic FK controls. So you can see we just have simple angle controls. I'm going to close up the icons here just to get a little more real estate here, that just allow us to individually position each of the structure elements. So we can just create manual poses on the tail. And this gives us a lot more direct control than the Bezier IK rig. But then we have the automatic overlap and follow through. And let's just take a look at basically how this works, and then I'll show you a few little variations here. So if we just simply create some simple rotation animation here. So I'm going to start with a keyframe at 0 rotation. And I'm just going to go forward a few frames here. And I'm just going to tilt the tail up a little. And you can already see it sort of bending there sort of in a natural way. And then we'll just copy and paste this 0 keyframe. Just go back to 0. And let's do a quick little RAM preview here. And watch what you get. Super cool. Automatic overlap and follow through. So nice. Now you have the ability to alter the flexibility and the resistance of the overlap effect. I find that for tails, the default settings actually work pretty good. Now you might be saying, well, this is great, but I don't want my tail just all stiff and straight like this. Well, you don't have to have that. What's cool is you can also add curvature with this curve control. You can curve the tail up or curve it down. And the automatic overlap and follow through will work either way. So it still works whether the tail is curved up or whether the tail is curved down. Really, really nice. Let's turn this to fast draft so this renders a little quicker. Okay, so this curve control allows you to get a really natural kind of being affected by gravity tail, or you can have the tail be bent up all nice and perky, and either way it's going to have that nice overlap and follow through. Now what's also cool is this overlap and follow through will work even if you add some kind of additional curves to the tail using these manual controls. Now, things can start to get a little clunky if you push this a little bit too far. But let's try this and just see how this works. There you go. So even a tail with a fun little S-curve will give you that nice overlap and follow-through effect. It's so great. So in my opinion, this FK overlap rig is a much, much better way to rig a tail than that Bezier IK rig, and it's really exactly the same amount of work. It just means you can't include the tail in the initial auto rig, but it's still just a question of selecting the layers and hitting one button and then parenting one controller, which is actually less work if you think about it, because the Bezier IK tail requires that you muck around with two additional different controllers, whereas this just has this one simple controller that you just have to parent in and then animate the rotation. So simple, and it works so great. As I said before, I don't really love the auto-rigged spines, and as we talked about in the torso lesson, I prefer manually rigging a spine with a separate chest and then a separate neck control. Now, I'm not going to demo this type of rig because we've already done it with the bipedal characters, and it's exactly the same. No difference. It's just laid out differently. But let's just take a look at how this works. So let's jump to Skelecat Rig 3. And you can see now that we have the pelvis control, the head, and the cog just the same. We have the mid control. It's just positioned up here now. But then we have this separate chest control. And what I really like about this is, besides being able to move the position of the chest, and note that when I do that, I don't get that weird extra movement on the head that I got with the neck and shoulder control. But I also can bend the chest or rotate the chest to get a really very realistic kind of movement in the body, which I really don't get with just neck control. And then I just simply have a separate neck control here on the chest controller to bend that neck. Everything else works exactly the same. Now the mid controller in this case just controls the shape of the little bit of spine in between the pelvis and the chest. So to me, this is just a better way to rig torsos in general, whether it's a biped or a quadruped. Now let's just take a really quick look at how the structure is laid out on the artwork. And I just want to point out one little issue with the puppet pins that just had to do with the way the character was designed. And this is again just proof that every rig has to be a little bit unique for each unique character. So let's just unshy these layers real quick, and let's just turn on the visibility of the spine elements. And you'll see that in this case, we only had to keep spine 1 and spine 2 aligned. Remember, the Bezier IK goes from the base of spine 3 to the base of spine 1. So we only had to keep those two straight. So we were able to shape this spine much more closely to the shape of the artwork, which also gives us a more realistic pivot point for the chest here. But because of the curvature of this character's spine, it meant that the position of spine 2 was quite a bit lower on the actual artwork of the spine. So if you look at the puppet pins on the body here, you'll see that I just positioned this pin just a little bit off where the actual spine structure is. But it's so close that it doesn't really make a huge difference, and all it is just this kind of rough mid-controller here. So having that pin exactly where that structure was not so critical. In a position like this where we're rotating right off of that pivot point, having that puppet pin right on that third spine structure is much more important. Here, not so important, so I was able to put it just a little bit off, and everything still works just fine. So it's just a little demonstration of how you have to be kind of flexible. You have to look at each situation as a unique situation and make small adjustments when necessary. We had to keep spine 1 and spine 2 straight. I goofed around with a few different placements for spine 1 and spine 3, but I was never able to get a straight line running through here that would have given me that position exactly where I wanted it. And it was more important to have a sensible placement of the hips and a sensible placement of spine 3. So part of it is about looking at what the priorities are, what's the most important thing for the rig. And in this case, this one little anomaly was much less important than the hips and spine 3, so it was an easy decision to make just to offset that puppet pin just a little bit. So you want to kind of start with the basic rules, but then be willing to be flexible when you run into unusual circumstances, which is going to happen pretty much on every rig to one degree or another. Now, another thing I want to point out is how I ended up placing the rotation control for the tail. So I've got the same FK control for the tail, but notice that even though its anchor point is still here at the base of the tail, I positioned the icon out at the end of the tail, which just keeps it from getting kind of tangled up with the pelvis control and makes it just a little bit easier to click and drag. Now, of course, when you change the curve control or you alter these angles, well, now suddenly the controller isn't really very close to the tail. But to me, this is still a little bit of better option than having the controller back here, where again, it kind of gets tangled up with the pelvis. But remember, again, your placement of your icons is really up to you. You can put them where you like. That just, to me, works nicely for the tail in this case. Oops, and I forgot to turn off the visibility of the spine layers there. Let's just do that quick before we move on here. Now, the other thing I've done here that we didn't look at in the previous rigs is I've gone ahead and rigged up the little eye. Now, this was done exactly the same way that we've rigged up other eyes before. Only difference is we only have the one in this case, since the head is a full side view. And then there's only one other small difference, which is I went ahead and rigged just a squash and stretch blink, even though this is an eye with a pupil. Kind of worked with this very, very simple eye. But if you look very closely, you'll notice that I'm not squashing and stretching the little wrinkles here, because that felt a little strange looking when I squashed and stretched everything, including those wrinkles. So let's just take a very quick look at that. I just want to show you how I solved that particular issue. So note that what I did was I masked out the eye. The eye and the wrinkles there were all on one layer. And I masked out just the eye, so I had just the eye alone. And then I masked off the top wrinkle and the bottom wrinkle individually. And then along with the squash and stretch animation, which is up here on the eye controller null, I created position and rotation movement animation for the wrinkles and tied those all to the slider. so that when we slide the blink down, we're squashing and stretching the eye and the pupil, but we're simply moving and rotating the wrinkles so they don't get kind of deformed in a really unpleasant way. Same with our little surprise stretch there on that squash and stretch. So it's just an example of how you can use the connector to create really precise types of deformations and animations tied to whatever controllers you want. And really the sky's the limit with the wonderful flexibility of that connector tool. All right, now we want to look at doing some simple ear rigs here. And I'm going to show you the very, very simplest kind of ear rig here with this Skelecat. And then we're going to take a look at some slightly more complicated ear rigs that give you just a little more expressive capability. So in this case, we just have single structures for the ears. And we just have the ear artwork parented right to those structures. So in the very simplest sense, we can just take the head controller and we can add an angle control. Or a couple rather, for the right and the left ear. Lock that effect control window, and we just have to grab the rotation values of these two different ears and just tie those to the angle controls. This creates fairly stiff ears. They don't sort of curve and bend. But they are very simple to create and will allow you to create some simple, fun poses with the ears. And especially if you have an animal with very small ears, these of course are pretty nice and tall, but a character with very small ears may not need much more than that. But we'll take a look at some more advanced ear rigs in a minute. Now all three of these Skelecat rigs have this very scrawny, jointed character with all the separated jointed pieces. This is actually going to be somewhat unusual for quadrupeds that are usually a little more furry and soft and don't necessarily lend themselves to complete jointing. So let's take a look at kind of a more normal type of quadruped with this Fox Rig 1. Now just a couple of things I want to point out here. This character has a manually rigged torso, so we have the individual chest control. Oops, let's unlock our effect control window there. We have the individual chest control with the individual neck control there. The tail is rigged with an FK tail rig. Everything's pretty much exactly the same. The small difference here is that the upper part of the legs, the upper and the lower leg, or the thigh and the calf, is actually a single piece of art rigged with a puppet tool, and then the foot and the claws are separate jointed pieces. So as I pick up this back leg, you can see how that upper leg is puppet tooled and the lower part of the leg is jointed. And just like with the arms and legs we looked at earlier, you can rig these with any combination of jointing or puppet tooling that serves your character and your character design best. You can have an entirely puppet tooled leg. You can have parts puppet tooled and parts jointed in any combination. Please remember that I could never show you every possible option, but you have all those options available to you. We've done a very similar thing with the arms here. In this case, the shoulder and the upper arm are puppet tooled, and then the forearm, hand, and claws are jointed. So when I pick this up, you can see that we're getting this nice bend in the puppet tooled shoulder and upper arm. The rest is all jointed. So again, any combination of jointing or puppet tooling is possible, and you just have to assess each situation and use the combination that works best. I should also remind you that you don't need the shoulder joint. That's not necessary. But I really think it does add a very nice level of realism to the movement and is a nice addition to quadruped rigs. We've also got simple button eyes here that are rigged up, and note that we're using a little mat using the head so that the eye wraps around the head as it gets close to that edge there, which gives us that sort of wraparound feeling, which is very nice. And we have blink and wink controls and separate pupil controls, the usual stuff. No surprises there, rigged exactly the way we rigged eyeballs with our bipeds. But I promised you some different ear rigs. So I've got this ear rigged up with a Bezier IK. So let's take a look at this. So I've got a controller here, a click and drag controller. And when I click and drag that, I just get this nice curvature. So the ear just sort of bends and curves in a natural way, all done with just one single controller. It's very nice, very easy to handle, and it just gives you a little more of an expressive, natural, flexible kind of an ear. So let's do the same rig with this ear here and just see how this goes together. We've got quite a bit of it done for you already, but let's unshy our layers and go down and look at our left ear. And you can see that we've already got the left ear with a puppet tool on it. We've got 4 puppet pins on that ear from the base up through the middle. And those are, of course, attached to our puppet bones there. And those puppet pins were aligned with these structures. Let's just solo these real quick because they're a little hard to see over the artwork. So we just have 3 structures and, of course, the end structure running up that ear. Now, you don't need 3. You can do it with 2, but I find you get a little nicer deformation with 3. If you have a very long ear, like a rabbit ear, you might want a few more. But again, remember, you don't want too many puppet pins. You want to try to go for sort of the fewest number of puppet pins possible. And remember, with our nice long tails, we just have 4 structures and 5 pins because you have the 1 pin at the end structure. So you don't want to overdo the number of structures or the number of pins. But we've already got this all parented together. So all we need to do to create the Bezier IK is just select the ear structures, all of the ear structures, go into the auto rig options and choose Bezier IK. That's going to give us our 3 controllers. Now we don't really need all 3 of these controllers. We only need the 1. You can, if you want to, leave the mid controller. It would allow you a little more control over the ear, but I kind of think it's overkill for these simple little ears. If you had long rabbit ears, you might want to leave that mid controller. That's up to you. But all we need to do now is simply rename this main controller. And let's resize it. Let's see, what did we do for this one here? 300. And we can simply turn off the visibility of the root and the curve controller. Oh, and let's also color this purple because it's a left-hand controller. And we'll color the layer purple as well. And we'll make sure that we shy away the root and the curve control. And then we just need to parent all of these all to the head controller and then zero out the ear control. Let's turn off our structures and lock everything up. And now we have the same nice click and drag control to just curve and bend that ear as we want to. Really nice way to get some nice cute little ear poses for this little fox character. Notice that I position all the controllers for all of these rigs again in stacking order. So starting with the artwork of the left leg, which is on top, because on a quadruped, if you imagine a quadruped run, for example, the arms go in between the legs and the legs come around the arms. Or if the character was going to scratch himself in the shoulder, that foot would want to be on top of that shoulder. So left leg on top. So the left leg controller should be on top. Whoops, I actually have it not quite on top there. There we go. So the left leg controller on top. Then the left hand, that's next. Then the left ear, even though artwork-wise it's actually sitting behind the head just for the look of it there. But in terms of the stack here, left ear next, and then all of the central controls of the body and the head. And then the right ear, and then the right hand, and the right foot. So again, controller stack should match the artwork stack. Even though technically this left ear is sitting behind the head just to get this little swoop to come across just for this look, conceptually the left ear is in front of the head and the right ear is behind. So you have to kind of balance the reality of the artwork with the kind of concept of what part of the body is sitting most towards us and which part of the body is sitting away from us. But it just gives you a good logical way to stack your controllers. Let's look at one other way of rigging ears. Now this Bezier IK rig for ears works pretty nice. You'll note that I didn't really love the Bezier IK for the tail. Works fine for ears. But just like with the tail, we can also use the FK overlap rig for ears and get some automatic overlap and follow through on the ears. So let's jump to Fox Rig 2 here. And you'll notice now we have a little controller up here that gives us that FK control. So first off, I have just individual control over the different parts of the ear. But perhaps more importantly, we have the auto overlap. So let's just look at how that works really quick. So again, I'm going to set a keyframe on that controller. We'll go ahead a few frames. Have that ear bend back a little bit. And then have the ear settle back into place. And we'll just RAM preview that. All right, super nice. There we've got our nice little simple automatic overlap and follow through. Really a nice addition there. And again, super, super simple to rig. So just like we did with the tail, we just need to find our left ear structure elements. Again, we've got the puppet tool set exactly the same way. The structures are exactly the same. Just 3 structures in a row. There's no difference here between the structures in the rig 1 here and this rig. They're set up exactly the same way. Puppet pins exactly the same, identical. So we just need to select the 3 main left ear structures. We can skip the end. We don't need the end structure. Just the main 3 structures there. And we go into the auto rig options and choose FK overlap. And in this case, even simpler, we just have to move the ear into place here. It's already purple because we did the last one purple. We'll shrink that icon size to match the other icon. I think this one's 400. Let's just, looks right. Yeah, 400. And just like we did with this one and like I did with the tail, I'm going to position this up above the ear. I just think it makes it a little easier to click and drag. It doesn't get kind of clumped up with all of the head artwork. Keeps click and drag controls away from the face, which I like. Okay, let's round these off. And turn that opacity down. And then we'll just arrange our controllers here. I like putting the overlap control underneath the FK controls, and then of course the controller itself under that. Now we also need to parent the ear controller to the head and zero out its position. We need to rename it too. And then one thing that I like to do with the ears is bring the flexibility amount down just a little. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's add just a little bit of animation to this. And by the way, don't be worried if, as you're posing a tail or an ear that has the FK overlap, don't be weirded out if it does some odd things. It'll sometimes behave a little strangely until you actually run the animation. Just be aware of that. Okay, so here it is with 100% flexibility, and you can see that ear is pretty rubbery. It's maybe a little more rubbery than really makes sense. This might work better if it was like a rabbit ear or something like that. But for this little fox character, we want it just a little bit less flexible. So I'm going to bring the flexibility down to 75%. And you can, of course, play around with this. If you want to bring it down more, you can. There we go. And that feels a little more natural to me, gives it a little more snap, and it's a little bit less rubbery. So it's a nice thing about this FK overlap is that you can adjust flexibility and resistance as much as you want to give it the kind of feeling you want. And of course, you still have the curve control, which it can just give you very basic poses on the ear without even having to touch the controller at all. And of course, as we looked at, we have individual control over each structure. So it gives you a lot of options for animating these ears. Plus, you get the wonderful auto overlap and follow through. Pretty great. Oops, and I just noticed I have my controller stack off here to foot on top. Small thing, but it's good to pay attention to those details. Okay, a really nice rig for this quadruped character, with auto overlap and follow through on the tail and on the ears. A nice manually rigged torso with control over the chest and neck separate. So this little fox rig is in really nice shape. In our very last lesson of the course, we're going to take a look at going through a final checklist to make sure that your rig is 100% functioning and ready to go, and then taking some final steps to prep the rig so it's all ready for animation. We're almost at the end. I'll see you in the last lesson.